Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 1, which was played on November 14th, 2011 from the Women's World Chess Championship match between the challenger Humpy Koneru of India, who's playing the white pieces, and the reigning Women's World Chess Champion Hou Yifan of China. The match is taking place in Tirana, Albania, and they're scheduled to play exactly 10 games with tie breaks in place if necessary. Regarding the time controls, both players begin with 90 minutes apiece, and should 40 moves be played within those 90 minutes, an additional 30 minutes is added to their clock. And one other note is that for every move played, 30 seconds is added to the clock. So that said, let's dive right in here. Game 1, Humpy Koneru on the white end, opening up with d4, and Hou Yifan, the reigning champion, knight f6, c4, e6, and we're running with the Catalan in this game 1, g3, getting ready for that bishop to be placed on the main diagonal. Black here, on the other hand, establishing a pawn in the center. Bishop g2, some standard development right out of the gates here. And now d takes c. So black gives up their center. And the main point behind this is to allow for black to activate their queen bishop. Not always the easiest thing to do, but by giving up the center, black is able to accomplish just that in the following way. Queen c2, looking to regain that pawn on c4, and while white goes after it, black gets ready for this b5 and then bishop b7 idea. So that's exactly what we see. Queen takes c, b5. This diagonal is open, but there's no way to exploit it with knight moves with the discovered attack on the rook just yet, because the queen is of course hit. The queen backs up, and now bishop to b7. Black has clearly solved one issue, that queen bishop getting active, but this pawn on the other hand is now backwards, and so from here on out a great deal of attention is now going to center around the c5 square and whether or not black can get that particular move in successfully. So we will see. At this point, bishop to d2 looks like one of those half developed type of moves. Yes, it's off the back rank, but beyond that, what is it doing? Well, it certainly is doing something else, and it's keeping a close eye on that a5 square. If black is just running with routine-like moves such as, okay, let's get my queen knight doing something with knight d7, well, bishop to a5 could be a serious problem. This pawn is not only backwards now, I can't get to that c5 square, but it's also in a pin right here, so that's not the greatest position to have to deal with. Additionally, you may very well see beyond this point white at some point playing b4, and that c5 square is officially locked down. So instead of knight to d7, we have bishop to e4, chasing that queen to a pretty awkward square, having to go back to the c1 square, avoid the capture, of course, of the queen, but still keep a close eye on that c5 square. So from here, black goes back to b7, and we could see something like the queen coming back to c2, bishop e4, and a little draw by repetition, but certainly on the white end you're looking for something more than just a draw. So instead we have a4, looking to maybe get this rook involved into the game, and maybe even target b5 at some point. You know, if nothing is done maybe with that b5 pawn just yet, we could have a capture and then the knight developing with tempo on the b5 pawn in some lines. But black puts an end to that right away, b4, and with that controlling a3, c3, and essentially telling the knight that it must develop to the d2 square. And so white sees that right away, and in order to finish their development, they're going to have to make use of d2 with that knight, and so the bishop needs to get out of the way. So bishop f4 with a threat on c7, knight d5, defense of it, and an attack on the bishop. Bishop g5, and certainly this is heading in a very positional type of territory, just getting ready to exchange off those dark square bishops, a good defender or a good piece that facilitates this c5 advance. So moving forward, more development on the black side, knight d7, once again supports that c5 advance. Bishop takes, queen takes, the queen is also keeping a close eye on that square, and now knight to e5. Now what's interesting is white could very well play a move like knight to d2, but it might be the case that white is going to run into some trouble because this queen isn't so happy on that c1 square. You could very well see this c-file opening up very quickly if knight d2, c5, and before you know it, there's going to be a rook coming here, and this could turn out to be maybe a bit problematic for white. And so taking that into consideration, white is not wanting black to play this c5 move, or in other words, they don't want to allow this c-file to open up just yet, and allow, in other words, a rook to be on c8 and attacking that queen in some lines. So instead, white runs with knight e5, and this move essentially prevents that type of advance, for if it's played, we capture first on d7 and then grab on c5. So after knight e5, we just have the exchange of knights. Knight takes, pawn takes, and now a5. And it's important to not get caught up in routine-like moves at this point on the black side. Now, for many moves already, I've been emphasizing this idea of black trying to get in c5. But there's a deeper, well, it's better said as such. And it's that c5 looks to get played in order to exchange off the c-pawn for white's d-pawn. But we clearly do not have that showing itself at this point. After knight came to that e5 and we had the exchange going on this e5 square, black isn't able to exchange off the c-pawn for the white d-pawn. And so we kind of have to switch gears here a little bit and take note of this bishop right here being unprotected, the knight being in a pin, and this knight right now really running out of squares. After pawn takes knight, if black were to, let's say, run with a very routine-like move, such as, okay, let's say rook f to d8, it seems very natural. This is an open file and rooks belong there. However, something like a5 really puts a serious constraint on this knight. In fact, there are no useful squares for it. Now, you may reason, well, I could make a square available for this knight. You know, right now e4 is the threat, and this knight does not have any squares right now. Everything is just being watched over wherever it goes. You may reason that what black can now play c5, and should e4 get played, well, the knight could reroute to, let's say, the c7 square. But looking a bit deeper, you may start to see, well, as soon as the c7 pawn moves, you'll note both b6 and d6 are now holes in the black position. And not only that, they're already acting as support points for a knight. So if we were to run with this, e4, knight goes back, this knight is going to be ecstatic about getting to that c4 square, having great possibilities in that of b6 and d6. And if black thinks that they could work around a knight being that deep in their position, they're pretty much crazy. You cannot allow a knight that deep in your position to just, you know, sit in those holes that are now created in your own position on b6 and d6. So it's important, in other words, to take into account this idea of white playing something like a5, restraining the knight and also creating a potential outpost on that b6 square, because this is a majority on the queen side, and it's something that black will ultimately like to get rolling at some point. You know, getting this pawn still to c5 and c4, but not just yet, because there's other things to take into account, namely this bishop on b7 getting on a better diagonal. And so it's at this point that black runs with a5, looking to get to that a6 square along this diagonal, and also keeping a close eye on c7 for this eventual knight pivot. So that's what we see next. Knight d2, bishop a6, knight c4, and black challenges this knight right away with queen to c5, watching over a5 and hitting this knight for a second time. At this point, there is, you know, a big decision to make. What do? Do you support your knight? Do you run away with your knight? Well, as white, you better just run away with your knight, because playing b3, what is that doing? It's weakening c3. Like I had pointed out on the black side of the board, you don't want to weaken necessarily the b6 and d6 squares. You know, similarly, white is not going to want to weaken that c3 square with a move like b3. So instead, we have knight e3 offering a queen exchange, and black does well, I believe, to avoid it. And they do just that with queen to e7. I bring that up because if you look at this variation right here, where we have a a queenless ending right now. Queen takes, rook takes. I did it with this one so that bishop takes pawn would not come with the threat on the rook. If we now had something like knight takes, well, actually that wouldn't be good because that'd be hanging the rook. But if bishop takes pawn, we could have knight takes, pawn takes, this sort of situation. And what has ultimately come about from this sort of variation is that black captured one of white's not so healthy pawns, and white captured one of black's healthy pawns. Or in other words, this sort of thing went on. Black got what? One of white's doubled pawns, that e2 pawn, and white ends up getting a healthy black pawn, that e pawn, ultimately. So it's not really that big of a deal that white has these doubled pawns in this variation, because white has a great deal of play for their rooks. In particular, that c5 square still shows itself and will act as an excellent post for a white rook, functioning both laterally and along the file and preparing to simply double. So black does well to just avoid the exchange of queens, in other words. Otherwise, those white rooks can get very active along the c file. So after knight e3, queen e7, rook to d1, and now we have rook to d8. A bunch of exchanges occur, and with these two pawns getting ready to capture, or getting ready to be captured, we have queen to c7 forcing the issue. White is looking to maintain this particular pawn. The further advanced one could be the one that's going to be more valuable, so let's hang on to this particular pawn and do away with this e2 pawn, in other words. So from here, queen c7 is hitting that bishop on a6, bishop takes e, rook takes d, rook takes, queen takes, and now the queen is getting ready to grab on a5, and it's an important one to hang on to, certainly, because this pawn is going to be very fast, and the rook is going to be in an ideal position behind that passed pawn to support its every move. So meeting that threat, we have c5, not just defending the pawn, but also looking forward to doing what? Advancing this majority. We have a 3-on-2, and that is now in effect. So rook to e1, bishop g4, and then rook to c1. So what was the quick reasoning behind first pivoting on e1? Well, it's putting a question to this bishop. Right now it's quite flexible from e2. It could come off on either of these diagonals. Let's first put a question to it, see what it wants to do. Okay, it went to g4. Let's come back to c1 now. What's the big difference? Well, if it came to c1 right away, you may very well see something like c4. Maybe that's an additional option black would then have. But by first putting a question to the bishop, you at least remove that as being a possibility. So bishop g4, rook c1, rook c8, and queen to c4, which is vacating this d5 square for the bishop and hitting this bishop on g4, to which black replies h5, protects the bishop, and creates a flight square, something black was still needing to do, seeing how there still are heavy pieces on the board, those major pieces, going to want to create a flight square for their king. And now bishop d5, pinpointing f7, also looking for this move e6, and we see that coming up shortly. Queen d7, adding some fuel to d5. Rook back to e1, again trying to get in that e6 move. After rook d8, there is more pressure that's being added to the bishop, but it can be ignored at this point. And well, actually, after this next sequence of moves, the smoke pretty much clears very quickly, and we get a fairly dry endgame. But after e6, there is no time to just go ahead and grab the bishop because of the in-between move. Pawn to e7, hitting the rook. This is the tactic of, what would you call it? Tactic of deflection. As soon as black is in a position where one of their pieces is tied down to the defense of one of their other pieces, we could have this idea of just trying to chase away that defender, the e7, trying to deflect away that rook from the defense of the queen. If queen takes queen, pawn takes rook, and what else is there at this point? Because this pawn is ready to queen in a couple different ways. So that's why we're not having, in other words, queen takes bishop in this position, but rather pawn takes, bishop takes. Series of exchanges ensues on that e6 square, and we get into a queen and rook endgame. Both sides have a flight square for their king, so not really a big deal with regard to king position. And now it's just a matter of making sure you just don't fall for little one-move threats, I believe, at this point. We have queen f3, the offer of a queen exchange, and with this, black has essentially calculated that they're going to be playing an endgame where they're down a pawn, but all the pawns are on one side of the board, and it's not really that difficult of a position to hold to a draw. So after queen f3, the queens come off. All pretty much forced at this point. Rook to e5. These are all essentially best moves. c4, rook takes a, rook to b3, and it's important not to go running after this h pawn. If rook takes h, black simply wins. These pawns are just too valuable and cannot be stopped. So don't go after this h pawn, but rather this pawn is more important to grab at this point. Rook takes b, rook takes c. And from here, you could start to just anticipate these guys are going to be exchanged, and it's just going to be a case of three versus these three pawns versus black's two, and it's not very difficult to draw at this point. So let's see how the game finishes up. This game actually runs for about another 40 moves, so I will not be making comments on everything. It is important to not exchange rooks. You don't want to simplify the position. Running with just king and pawn type of positions, there's often more calculation needed in a king and pawn type of an endgame opposed to king, rook, and pawn. So black does well to, in other words, keep the rooks on the board and make sure that this king does not get too active. This rook wants to always keep this king at bay, doesn't want to allow it to get super active and, let's say, challenge that g6 pawn at some point. So the rook is playing back. We see this in many instances just to prevent this rook from flushing this king backwards. So rook d4, the king is just inching over. A lot of shuffling. Finally, we have some progress being made with regard to the pawns. And this rook lift right here to this c5 square is just making sure that if any one of these pawns comes up, the rook is there to watch over that. The rook is really well placed on that c5 square. And eventually white comes up with some idea after f4, looking to challenge this rook along the 5th rank. And black just takes the opportunity now to start thinking about giving checks from behind. And that's exactly what we see going on. A lot of shuffling at this point, not really a whole lot of progress. And now this is just officially just going to be a drawn position. Just being able to keep checking that king and make sure that the main thing here at this point is to just not allow that white king to get in front of this pawn. That's just the quick summary at this point, and black with these moves is not allowing white to do just that. And so after the 80th move, we have just this game 1 of the Women's World Chess Championship match ending in a draw. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.